I am Professor Bill Rees. I'm a full-time barrister at Atlas Chambers in Gray's Inn in London, and my topic today is the New Companies Act of 2006. And I'm going to open by talking on the background to the new Act, which got royal assent on November the 8th, 2006. There has been a very long and winding road to reform in the company law area since 1998. And I'm going to begin, first of all, by talking briefly about the Company Law Review. The story began with the commissioning of the DTI Company Law Review, which I shall call the CLR, in March of 1998, by the then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Margaret Beckett. It was intended to be a fundamental and genuinely independent review of company law, albeit under the auspices of the DTI. So a project director, Mr. Jonathan Rickard, an experienced solicitor, was put in place, along with a steering group with the director of the DTI's Company Law and Investigations Directorate in the chair. The aim was to develop a simple, efficient and cost-effective framework for British business fit for the 21st century. A series of working groups were set up with specialists sitting on those with their own particular areas of expertise. A consultative committee was also put in place. In short, then, extensive consultation was the hallmark of this review process. The steering group prepared a significant number of consultative documents, and it was ultimately responsible for the substantial final report in 2 volumes. The then Law Commissioner, Dame Mary Arden, Lady Justice Mary Arden as she now is, who at that time had particular responsibility for looking at company law at the Law Commission, was one of those who joined the steering group. The review group, for example, consulted, on capital maintenance and acted on the product of an earlier consultation on the issue of purchase by a company of its own shares. In October 2000, the review group issued for consultation Modern Company Law for a Competitive Economy, Registration of Charges. A number of these documents are still worth referring to today. The issue of corporate governance was an important element of the work done as part of the overall consultation exercise undertaken by the review group.